A waitress brushed the hair from a little boy's head, and her fingers touched something that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath his curls were 12 metal thumbtacks, pushed directly into his skull. The boy had been hiding them for weeks, enduring the pain in silence, because he believed if anyone found out, they would discover who his father really was and take him away forever. His father was not just any man. He was one of the most feared crime bosses in Chicago, and the moment he saw what was done to his son, something inside him snapped. But what happened next was not what anyone expected. This is not just a story about revenge. This is a story about a broken man, a wounded child, and a waitress who carried her own invisible scars, and how one act of courage in a small-town diner changed all of their lives forever. This story will remind you that real strength is not about power or control. It is about having the courage to be vulnerable, to look closer when everyone else looks away, and to choose love over fear. If you have ever felt invisible, or if you have ever been the one person who noticed someone else's silent pain, this story is for you. Ronan Caruso sat in a simple gray car outside the school. He slipped his expensive watch into the glove box next to his family ring. His fine suit was gone, replaced by an old jacket. He was no longer a feared crime boss. He was just a father. Then he saw his son, Jonah. The boy's small frame emerged from the gates, his backpack sagging. A cold feeling hit Ronan's stomach. It was the same instinct that warned him of danger on the streets. Jonah's head was bowed, his dark hair hiding his face. He shuffled his feet, moving with a heavy sadness. Ronan's voice was soft when he called out. He spoke gently to his son, a thing few men had ever heard. Jonah gave no answer about his day. He only shrugged and got into the car, his head still down. His knuckles were white from gripping his backpack straps. Ronan's heart ached. He remembered being that quiet boy, hiding his own hurt. He offered to get ice cream, a trick that always worked. But Jonah just shook his head. That was when the fear became real. Jonah always wanted ice cream. At their safe house, the boy ignored his usual comforts. No sketchbook, no television, no apple. He simply folded himself into a corner of the couch. He was completely still, except for a tiny tremor. Only Ronan's watchful eyes could see it. The powerful man knelt, his own gaze now filled with fear. "Jonah, look at me," he pleaded, but his son refused, and Ronan understood that his entire empire was worthless. He could not get his own 8-year-old son to speak. Ronan stood, looking at the small, wounded shape on the sofa. His hands, usually so deadly, felt useless. Then he remembered Pinewood Diner. It was their place, their one safe spot outside the house. It was the only other place Jonah ever seemed relaxed. "Come on, son," Ronan whispered. "Let's go have dinner at Pinewood." For a long moment, there was no reply. Then Jonah moved off the couch without a single sound. He seemed to be trying to disappear completely. Ronan drove in silence, watching his son in the rearview mirror. The boy was a small, huddled shape, hidden by his hair. Ronan knew better than to force him to talk. That only made things worse. Soon, they arrived at Pinewood Diner. Its neon sign glowed in the twilight. A bell chimed as they entered, and the warm smell of coffee and apple pie filled the air. The small diner had about 12 worn vinyl booths and an old oak counter. Old photos of Chicago hung on the walls. It felt more like home than any of his own expensive places. Here, he was not the head of the Caruso family. He was just a dad getting dinner with his son. A waitress emerged from behind the counter. Her name was Willa Sinclair. She was only 27 years old, but her eyes looked much older, filled with a deep weariness. Her thin frame was lost inside her uniform, but her smile for Jonah was always genuine. It was as if the little boy made her long day worthwhile. Ronan had noticed she always wore long sleeves, but he never asked about it. "The usual for you two, right?" Willa asked, her warm voice filling the space. She led them to their favorite corner booth by the window. Jonah slid in, keeping his head low and his backpack clutched tight. Willa set out crayons like she always did, but this time Jonah did not reach for them. He did not begin to draw. Willa's brown eyes met Ronan's for a brief moment. An unspoken question passed between them. "Same as always," Ronan said, trying to keep his voice steady. He ordered his steak and a grilled cheese for his son. He used his usual nickname, calling Jonah his little artist. Normally, Jonah would smile and correct him. Tonight, there was nothing but silence. Willa wrote down the order and walked to the kitchen, glancing back at the boy one last time. She returned 15 minutes later with their food. She placed Ronan's steak down, then carefully set the grilled cheese in front of Jonah. The plate made a quiet sound as it touched the table. It was a normal, everyday noise, but Jonah reacted as if he had been struck. A pained sound escaped his lips. His small body went stiff, his shoulders shooting up to his ears. Ronan's fist tightened under the table. Willa froze, her arms still out. Her eyes widened with a terrible recognition. She had seen that kind of fear before, but it was 20 years ago, in herself. It was the fear that a sudden noise meant you were about to be hurt. She took a slow breath and forced a smile before walking away, her own mind screaming. From the counter, she watched their table. The grilled cheese was untouched. It was already getting cold. Jonah just sat there, his head bowed low, his small shoulders shaking in a terrible rhythm. He trembled with a quiet rhythm of pain, something he had learned to endure long ago. Ronan, his father, was not eating. A steak knife sat untouched in his hand as he watched his son. The lines around his eyes deepened with every tremor that shook Jonah's small body. Willa saw that the big man with the cold gaze was afraid. It was the deep fear of a father who was powerless to help. Willa went to the refrigerator. She scooped vanilla ice cream, milk, and chocolate syrup into a blender. Its low hum briefly filled the quiet diner. She had made this exact drink for Jonah more than a dozen times. He always looked up at the sound, knowing something sweet was coming. But today, Jonah did not raise his head. Willa poured the milkshake into a glass, added whipped cream and a cherry, and brought it to their table. She spoke with a light voice. "A special for my favorite artist. No charge." She set the glass down so gently it made no sound. After a few heavy seconds, Jonah slowly lifted his head to see the drink. He looked through his messy hair, keeping his face hidden. But Willa saw his chapped lips move. "Thank you," he whispered. The words were so soft, she almost missed them. "You are welcome, sweetheart," Willa said, biting her cheek to keep her voice steady. Ronan gave her a look that was a mix of gratitude and agony, then nodded. It was a thank you for something much bigger than a milkshake. Jonah reached for the straw. His hand moved slowly, as if the motion itself was painful. As his arm lifted, the sleeve of his large jacket fell back. It revealed a dark bruise on his tiny wrist, ringed in black and blue. It was not the kind of mark from a simple fall. It was intentional. It was a shape Willa had seen on her own arm 15 years ago. She turned away before Ronan could see her expression. She needed a moment to think, to choose her next action carefully, so she would not frighten the boy even more. When she faced them again, she wore the smile she had perfected over 20 years to hide her own history of pain. "Jonah," she said, "I need your artistic eye to help me arrange the sugar packets. I want them to look nice. I will pay you with another milkshake." Ronan glanced at his son and nodded. "Go on, son. Help her." Jonah slid from his seat. He moved like he was made of fragile glass, afraid of breaking. He followed Willa behind the counter, out of view of the other diners. She gave him a low stool next to the coffee station. The sugar packets were all mixed up in a tray. She knelt beside him. "We will sort them by color, like a rainbow," she said softly. "I bet you can make them look great." Jonah sat hunched over, his head still down, but his small fingers began to sort the packets, placing blue with blue and yellow with yellow. Willa saw a flicker of peace cross his tense shoulders. She lifted her hand to gently brush back his hair. It was something she had done many times before, and he had never pulled away. But as her fingers touched his head, she felt something wrong beneath the curls. It was hard and sharp. It was not his scalp. It did not belong on a child. She felt another, and then another. Her hand pulled back. She looked at her fingertips and saw a dark, crusted substance. She knew it was dried blood. The blood was hidden under hair that he kept long not by choice, but to hide something awful. Jonah made a small, sharp sound of pain and jerked back from her. The stool scraped loudly on the floor. For the first time, his eyes flew open. In his gray eyes, the same as his father's, Willa saw a look of pure terror. It was the fear of a small animal that has been hurt so many times it expects every touch to be a blow. Willa's hands trembled, but she kept them at her sides. She would not show her panic. The child was terrified, and she had to be the calm one. Willa took a slow, deep breath, forcing her voice to sound normal, even as her chest ached. "Jonah," she said gently, speaking as if to a frightened bird. "I have some new crayons in the back I have been saving just for you. Would you like to see them? And while we are there, I can give your hair a little trim to neaten it up. We should let everyone see your beautiful eyes. It is a shame to hide them." Her tone was so ordinary that it surprised even her. She was performing well, with the dried blood of a hurt child still on the fingers she kept hidden behind her back. Jonah looked toward his father. Willa understood. She leaned out from the counter and caught Ronan's attention. "I am borrowing the artist for a minute," she called out. "I have some new art supplies for him." Ronan simply nodded, happy that his son was finally engaging with someone. Willa led Jonah through the swinging door into the storage room. It was a small, clean space that smelled of fresh bread. Cans and sacks of flour lined the walls. In a corner, a table was set up for children to draw when the diner was not busy. She placed a chair near the sink and patted the seat. "Sit here, okay? I will be very gentle. If you want me to stop, just tell me." Jonah sat down slowly, moving carefully to protect his head. Willa put a clean towel over his shoulders. She took out a pair of scissors and cleaned them with disinfectant. Her hand was slick with sweat as she picked them up. She started cutting at the back of his neck, taking small, light snips. The first piece of hair fell, showing healthy skin. The second piece fell, revealing a dark red mark. When the third piece of hair fell, she saw it. A metal thumbtack was pushed directly into the boy's scalp. The flat head was visible among the cut hair, surrounded by angry, swollen skin and crusted with dark blood. Willa froze, the scissors hanging in the air. She had to bite her tongue to stop from crying out. She kept cutting, even more slowly now. With every lock of hair that fell, another tack appeared. 2, then 5, then 8. They were scattered across his head, from the crown down to his neck and temples. Some were pushed in so deep that only the flat tops were visible. Others were stuck in at sharp angles, as if done with violent haste. The skin around each one was red and infected. Willa counted them. She did not want to, but she could not stop. 11, 12. Each tack was a silent scream the boy had hidden. Her hand shook so much she had to put the scissors down. Memories flooded her mind like ice water, the smell of bourbon and cigarettes in a foster home. A rough hand pulling her across a tile floor, the burn of a cigarette on her arm, and a harsh whisper, "Keep quiet. No one will believe you." She remembered holding a student, his back covered in bruises. She promised him protection, but she got fired and the boy was left behind. She remembered the alley, her brother's body by a dumpster, his eyes staring at nothing. She was always too late. But not this time. Willa pushed the memories down and knelt to face Jonah. He cried without making a sound. The tears just ran down his face, as if he knew being loud was a mistake. Who did this? Willa's voice was soft, but inside she wanted to break everything. Jonah just shook his head, his lips trembling. He whispered so quietly she had to lean in. "I cannot say. If I do, they will ask questions. They will learn who my dad is. Then the bad people will come for him like they did for my mom. My dad will be gone, and I will have no one." Willa did not understand it all. She did not know why a boy of 8 feared his father's name. But she understood one thing perfectly. This little boy was holding a secret that was crushing him. He was taking the pain to keep his father safe. Willa slowly raised her hands where Jonah could see them. She gently put her arms around him, holding him like someone should have held her when she was a lost child. For a moment, Jonah was stiff. Then he relaxed against her, his tears soaking her shirt. He finally let himself cry, still without a sound. "I will protect you," Willa whispered. Her voice cracked on the last word. "I promise. No one will hurt you again." She held him for another moment, then eased back and put her hands on his shoulders. She looked right into his wet gray eyes. "Stay right here for me, okay? I am going to get your dad. Do not be afraid." Jonah grabbed her wrist with his small hands, shaking his head hard. "Please, no. He will be so angry. He will do something bad." Willa gently pulled her hand free. "Your dad has to know. You cannot carry this by yourself." She stood and left the storage room before he could plead again. If she heard that child beg one more time, she knew she would fall apart. She walked into the diner, and the warm light felt strange on her face. Her eyes were red, and her hands were shaking, but it did not matter. Ronan was on his feet by the table. His instincts must have told him something was wrong. The normal worry was gone from his face. In its place was something harder, darker, and much more dangerous. "You need to come with me," Willa said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "But you have to promise me you will be calm. Jonah needs you to be calm." Ronan's steel eyes met hers. For a second, Willa saw a dangerous light flicker in them. This man was not just a father out for dinner with his son. He gave one sharp nod and followed her into the storage room. Jonah was still on the chair. His fresh haircut showed his scalp and everything that had been hidden there. Ronan froze 3 feet from his son. Willa watched his expression change. First came confusion, his mind trying to understand what he saw. Then came recognition, his eyes widening as the color drained from his face. It was followed by pure, raw horror, the kind a parent feels seeing their child broken. And after the horror came rage. It was not a loud or sudden anger. It was a cold, slow power building deep inside him, ready to tear the world down. A vein pulsed on his temple. His jaw was clenched so tight she heard his teeth grind. His hands became fists, and each knuckle popped. This was not the anger of a normal father. It was the fury of a caged animal watching someone harm its young. The small room felt like it was shrinking. The air grew thick, as if Ronan was stealing all the oxygen. Willa took a step back without thinking. Then Jonah whispered one word, "Dad." In an instant, the rage was gone. Ronan moved forward and fell to his knees before his son. The same large hands that looked so dangerous were now shaking as they held Jonah's face. His thumbs gently wiped away the tears. "Who?" Ronan asked. The word was so low it was a vibration in Willa's chest. Jonah threw his arms around his father's neck, crying into his shoulder. "Please do not do anything. Do not let them know who you are. If they find out, they will take you away like they took Mom. You promised." Ronan held his son tightly, his own head bowed onto Jonah's shoulder. Willa saw his body shake. The man was crying, but with no tears and no sound. The secret they shared was bigger than she could imagine, but that could not stop her. She waited for Ronan to look up. His gray eyes found their focus. Her voice was like iron. "You are taking Jonah to a hospital. Now. He needs scans and proper care. He has an infection, and Illinois law demands that doctors report it. You do not have a choice." Ronan looked at her, and for the first time, Willa saw a pure and dangerous warning in his eyes. It was aimed directly at her. "You do not get it," he said softly. "A hospital means police and official record. It will lead to a place I cannot let it go." Willa did not move. She had backed down once before in her life. For a principal who told her not to make a scene. That child remained with his abuser, a failure she wore like a scar. "I do not know what you are hiding," Willa said, her gaze steady, "but your son has metal tacks in his head. If he is not at a hospital in 30 minutes, I will call 911. That is your choice." A heavy silence filled the small room. Willa watched the war behind Ronan's eyes, a fight between his need for darkness and his son's need for light. Then Ronan's eyes closed. He took a long breath. When he opened them, the danger was gone, replaced by a father's defeat. He gently moved Jonah from his shoulder, looked at him, and promised, "I will keep you safe." He stood, pulled out his phone, and turned his back to Willa. His voice was so cold, the room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Get the car. St. Mary Hospital. No guards, no guns, nothing. 15 minutes. The door shut behind him. Willa stood with Jonah, her fingers still shaking, but inside, she felt a solid sense of purpose she had not known in 2 years. The gray car flew through the dark streets of Oak Park. Ronan held the steering wheel so tight the leather groaned. Willa was in the back, with Jonah curled against her. She held him carefully, avoiding his head. The 12-minute ride was quiet except for Jonah's soft breathing and the sound of tires screeching around corners as Ronan broke the speed limit. At the emergency entrance, a black Lincoln was there. A man named Salararo was leaning on it, his face like stone, but his eyes showed his worry when he saw Ronan carrying Jonah. Started to walk forward, but Ronan gave a sharp shake of his head. The loyal man immediately stepped back, pulled open the emergency doors, and then melted into the shadows of the parking lot. The emergency department was blindingly white under fluorescent lights. The sharp smell of antiseptic filled the air. A nurse looked up at the tall man with the small child. Her face held the familiar look of someone who had witnessed too much suffering. She immediately called for the doctor on duty. Dr. Alan Marsh came out in under 5 minutes. He was 55, with gray hair and glasses. His large hands moved with a surprising gentleness. He led them to a private room, placed Jonah on the exam bed, and switched on the overhead light. All the kindness vanished from his face. He was quiet for a few seconds, just pulling on gloves and leaning close to the boy's scalp, using sterile tools to part the boy's hair. Willa saw the doctor's jaw tighten as he began to count. He counted out loud, his voice low and formal. 1, 2, 3, 4. Each number landed like a hammer blow in the quiet room. 5, 6, 7. Willa held Jonah's hand, fighting the image of someone deliberately pushing metal into this child's skin. 8, 9, 10. Ronan stood in the corner, his face blank, but his eyes never left his son. Willa knew that blank expression was not calmness. It was every bit of his willpower focused on not tearing the room apart. 11, 12, 13, 14. Dr. Marsh stopped. He took a deep breath and cleaned his glasses. Then he spoke, his voice shaking with fury. 14 thumbtacks, based on the inflammation. Some have been there for 5 to 7 days. 2 are infected and will need medicine. I have to remove them all. It will hurt. And under Illinois law, I have to report this to the state's Child Services Department. It is my legal duty, with no exceptions. Ronan started to speak, but Willa caught his eye and gave a tiny shake of her head. The small gesture was enough to silence him. She wondered when she had gained that kind of power over such a man. Dr. Marsh began to pull out the tacks, one by one. Each time, Jonah squeezed Willa's hand until her knuckles were white. But he did not scream or fight. He just shut his eyes and bit his lip until it bled. His silent bravery was worse than any sound he could have made. Willa leaned close to Jonah's ear and told him a story in a soft, steady voice. It was about a yellow cat she once knew named Biscuit, who loved to sleep in her shoes. She told him how Biscuit would chase sunbeams and run into furniture, then pretend nothing had happened. She kept telling stories without a pause because with each word she spoke, Jonah's grip loosened and his breathing calmed. She would have talked all night if it would lessen his pain. Ronan stood in the corner for the whole 40 minutes. He could not stand to watch the doctor removing the metal from his son. Instead, he watched Willa. He watched the woman in the dirty diner apron hold his son's hand. Her voice was the gentlest thing he had heard since his wife sang their son to sleep 3 years ago. He saw how she held Jonah, trying to shield him from the world. She did not cry because she knew the child needed her to be strong. For 3 years, Ronan's heart had held only rage and nothing else. Now, something new started to grow. It was just a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. But that is how every dam begins to fail. Dr. Marsh put the last thumbtack on a stainless steel tray. 14 of them were lined up like silent judges under the bright light. He started cleaning and bandaging the wounds, telling Jonah he was the bravest boy he had ever met. Jonah opened his exhausted eyes and looked at Willa. She smiled at him, not realizing her own tears were finally falling. Ronan stayed in the corner, silent. But the look in his eyes when he saw Willa had changed. The doctor stepped out to make the official report. When he came back, he told Ronan that a police investigator was on the way. He said it was mandatory, and he had no choice. Ronan stood by the bed where Jonah was now asleep, his head wrapped in bandages, his hand still holding Willa's. Willa saw his jaw clench at the word investigator, but he only nodded once and walked into the hall. Through the glass, Willa watched him take out his phone. He turned his back, said a few quiet words, and hung up. When he returned to the room, his face was a perfect mask. The dangerous man was gone, replaced by a worried, suburban father who seemed confused and scared. It was the exact face anyone would expect to see. Willa shivered. He was acting, and he was terrifyingly good at it. 20 minutes later, someone knocked on the exam room door. A woman walked in. She was about 38, with dark hair in a ponytail and sharp, focused eyes. A silver badge and a gun were clipped to her belt. She introduced herself as Investigator Priya Navarro. From the Special Crimes Unit, her voice was professional but not unkind. She had seen enough to know victims needed calm. Her eyes scanned the room, stopping on Ronan for just a second too long. Willa saw her brow furrow slightly. It was the look of someone trying to remember a face. Ronan offered his hand. "I am Ronan, Jonah's father." His voice trembled just enough to sound like a scared parent. It was not too shaky, not too calm. Navarro shook his hand and sat in a chair next to the bed where Jonah was awake. Watching her with tired eyes, Willa stood on the other side, still holding Jonah's hand. Navarro asked who she was. Willa Sinclair, she said, a family friend. The word family felt surprisingly true for people she only knew from milkshakes. Navarro opened her notebook. I know you are tired, she said softly to Jonah. You have been very brave. I just have a few questions. Can you tell me who hurt you? Jonah looked at his father. In that single glance, a whole conversation passed between them. Jonah asked if he should tell. Ronan gave a tiny nod. It was permission, but it was filled with pain. He knew every answer brought another stranger closer to their secret. Jonah looked back at Navarro. His voice was very small. A group of boys targeted my son at school. Their leader was Trent Hargrove. He was older, and the others did whatever he said. He promised Jonah that tomorrow would be worse if he told anyone. This is what power does. It shields the wicked. But what happens when that shield breaks? Navarro's face remained neutral, but her pen dug into the page as she wrote the name, Lincoln Elementary. The words hung in the air. This had been going on for months. All school year, my child had been coming home in pain, and nobody knew, not his teachers, not me. Ronan shut his eyes for a moment. I saw his fist tighten until his arm shook with rage. Did you tell a teacher? Jonah shook his head. Did you tell your dad? Jonah just stared at the blanket, and his silence was heavier than any words. Navarro wrote something down and underlined it twice. Then she turned to Ronan. Do you know the Hargrove family? Ronan shook his head, playing the part of an overworked father. I do not know many parents. I am busy. He sounded just ashamed enough for the role. Willa would have applauded if the situation were not so serious. But Navarro was not convinced. She looked at Ronan like he was a puzzle with a missing piece. What do you do for work? She asked. Restaurants, Ronan replied without hesitation. I manage a few of them. Navarro made a note and closed her book. She said she would call the school in the morning and left her card. But at the door, she turned back. She held Ronan's gaze for a long time. Willa watched him stand perfectly still, a calm surface, hiding the rapid pulse in his neck. When the door finally closed, Ronan let out a breath. It was not a sigh of relief. It was the sound of a man who had just walked through a minefield and was not yet sure he was safe. Ronan waited for Jonah to fall asleep. He tried to gently pull his son's hand from Willa's, but Jonah's grip held strong, even in his dreams. Ronan looked at Willa for a moment. Stay with him, he said. I need to leave for a little while. Willa nodded, asking no questions. Her simple trust made him pause at the door. In the hall, beyond the view of the security cameras, he pulled out his phone and dialed S. The man answered on the first ring. Ronan spoke in fast, quiet Italian. Trent Hargrove, I want his family. Where they live, what they do, who they know. I want their debts and their secrets. I want everything by noon tomorrow. Done, S replied, and the line cut. Ronan leaned his head against the cold wall. He tried not to picture the 14 thumbtacks from the exam room, but every time the image returned, his hands clenched, ready to find the person responsible. 3 hours later, Willa was in a taxi. Ronan carried a sleeping Jonah to S's car and drove home. He put his son to bed, watching the boy's bandaged face in the soft glow of a nightlight. He kissed his forehead and went outside. A black Lincoln was waiting. It took him to a place only the Caruso family knew existed, the basement of Veo Italian restaurant. A steel door was hidden behind a wall of wine. Inside, S was waiting at a heavy oak table. Beside him, sat Mikey Key, a man with a violent energy that Ronan both valued and feared. At the head of the table was Gino Palmieri, the family advisor. He was 50 years old, with sharp eyes and a wisdom that had served 3 generations of Carusos. Ronan trusted Gino with his life. S placed a thin file on the table. Inside was the profile of Trent Hargrove, a 10-year-old in 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. His mother was Diane Hargrove, and his father was Charles Hargrove, a civil litigation attorney. They lived in Kenilworth, the most affluent part of the North Shore. Diane was a powerful figure on the school board and a major donor to local charities. She had a spotless reputation. Before S could finish, Mikey shot to his feet, his palms hitting the table. "Boss, I just need their address. Give me 15 minutes with them tomorrow night. No weapons. They will beg for forgiveness, or I will burn their house down." Gino ignored Mikey, calmly sipping his espresso. He had seen too many impulsive men destroy themselves. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "If you do that, the police will swarm their home the next morning. Hargrove is a lawyer and will bring in investigators. They will search until they find out who was involved and why his son was targeted. Then they will find the bullied child and his father. If they dig deep enough, they will discover that the ordinary dad is Giancarlo Ronan Caruso. After that, the FBI and every enemy you have ever made will know you have a son. What will they do then?" The room fell silent. Mikey slowly sat down, his jaw tight. He knew Gino was right. Ronan's fists landed on the heavy oak table. His voice was a low growl, unrecognizable from the one he used with his son. "So, what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and watch them torture my boy? Am I supposed to tell him he cannot cry out because of who his father is?" No one dared to answer. Gino met Ronan's furious gaze without fear. "There is a different way," he said calmly. "A solution that involves no violence. Nothing the law can trace back to this family. You need someone inside the school, someone to protect the boy quietly. A clean outsider." Gino paused, taking another drink. "I believe you met her tonight at that diner." Ronan was silent, but the image of Willa at Jonah's bedside, holding his hand while talking about a cat named Biscuit, filled his mind. The next day, Navarro arrived at Lincoln Elementary at 8:15, well before the first bell. She wanted to see the children in their natural state. Standing by the fence, she scanned the yard for Trent Hargrove. Not knowing his face, she watched for boys who moved with arrogance, who led packs that other children feared. At 9 o'clock, she entered the principal's office. The walls were covered in plaques and photos. Harold Bryce stood to greet her. Navarro instantly recognized his smile as one of a man who had been warned of her visit. He was 52 and balding, with a small paunch under his shirt. Bryce offered a clammy handshake and a chair. Navarro remained standing, opened her notebook, and asked about Trent Hargrove and any bullying reports concerning a student named Jonah. Bryce leaned back, his fingers laced together. He began with a familiar line. "We take student safety very seriously." He claimed to have no record of serious incidents and described Trent as an excellent student. He mentioned that the Hargrove family was a generous benefactor. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he concluded. Navarro kept writing, letting him speak. Liars often reveal themselves when given enough room. When he finished, she asked one question. "Were you aware a student was in the emergency room last night with 14 thumbtacks pulled from his scalp?" The color drained from Bryce's face. He looked like a man whose secrets had just been unearthed. He stammered that he knew nothing about it and promised an immediate internal review. Navarro noted his reaction and asked to see Trent Hargrove. Bryce insisted he had to call the parents first, citing school policy. Navarro knew it was a delay tactic. 45 minutes later, Diane Hargrove entered the office, and the entire situation shifted. She was 45, with sharp blonde hair and a dress that cost more than Navarro's monthly salary. Her expensive fragrance preceded her. She was not alone. A man in a three-piece suit identified himself as the family's legal counsel. From that point on, the lawyer answered every question. Diane sat perfectly still, a polite smile fixed on her face. Her tone was sweet, but her words were sharp. "My son is a gentle child," she said. "Our family has supported this community for years. I feel for the other boy, but perhaps you should investigate his father before blaming my son. No one knows anything about him or where those injuries really came from." Navarro's expression remained neutral, but she noted how quickly Diane had gone on the attack. The lawyer then presented a large folder. It contained Trent's perfect records and a letter threatening legal action for any baseless accusations. Navarro accepted the packet, looked Diane in the eye, and said she would be in touch. She left without another word. Driving back to the station, her phone rang. It was Lieutenant Morrison. His voice was tense. He said the Hargrove law firm had already called and warned that the family had deep connections within the county's justice system. Morrison told her to be careful, which Navarro knew was an order to drop the case, but she could not let it go. The image of the 8-year-old boy in the hospital, his head covered in white bandages, was burned into her mind. She thought about taking the case to the FBI, but she had no real proof. The word of a child against the legal power of the Hargrove family was not enough. Navarro sat in her parked car, staring ahead. For the first time in her 12-year career, she felt the system she had sworn to uphold was failing the very child it was meant to defend. 3 days later, Willa stood outside a house on Elmwood Street at 7 in the evening. Her finger paused just above the doorbell. She wondered why she was there and why her heart was pounding so hard. All she wanted was to speak to the father of the boy she served grilled cheese to each week. Willa got the address from the hospital. She had signed herself as Jonah's second emergency contact because Ronan had no one else to list. Heavy footsteps approached the door before it opened. Ronan stood there, wearing a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. For a second, Willa saw a tattoo on his forearm before he quickly pulled the sleeve down. He looked surprised to see her, but simply opened the door wider. She stepped inside and saw the house for the first time. It was simple, except for one thing, a single photograph on the wall. It was a young woman with bright eyes holding a newborn. Her smile was radiant. Willa knew at once it was Jonah's mother. The woman whose memory Jonah feared would be ruined if people knew who his father was. "Where is Jonah?" Willa asked. "Asleep," Ronan said. "He took some pain medicine. For days he had been going to bed early." They stood apart in the living room, a 3-step distance that felt like a mile and no space at all. Willa decided on a direct approach because she was not good at circling a point. She said, "I have a proposal. There is a part-time art aide job at Lincoln Elementary, paid for by a Cook County grant. It does not need a teaching license, only a degree and experience with kids. I have both. I want that job so I can be at the school near Jonah." Ronan watched her, his gray eyes searching her face for a hidden motive. After a long silence, he asked a single, heavy word. "Why?" Willa knew this man was not used to kindness without a cost. In his world, everyone wanted something. She could have given easy answers. "Because I like Jonah, because I used to be a teacher." But those were not the whole truth. She looked straight into his eyes and told him the secret she had only ever confessed to her studio walls in the dead of night. Because I was once a child that nobody protected. I was in 3 foster homes. In the first 2, they hurt me, burned me, and locked me in closets. No adult ever saw, or maybe they just looked away. When I grew up, I became a teacher. I promised myself I would never look away, but I saw a child being harmed, and I reported it. They fired me, and the child remained in that home. I live with that failure every single day. I see Jonah, and I see myself. I see the child I could not save. I will not fail a 3rd time. When she finished, the room was completely quiet. Only a clock ticked on the wall. Ronan looked at her, and something changed in his eyes. It was not softness. It was recognition. It was the look of a man seeing a scar on someone else that matched his own. He turned to the window and stared into the darkness. After a long moment, he spoke without turning around. "Do you know who funds that school?" "The Hargrove family. The mother is on the board. If you apply the normal way, Bryce will block you. She will stop anyone connected to Jonah." Willa had already figured that out. "That is why I need a community grant from outside the school. Cook County issues it, so the board cannot stop it. The school just has to accept me." Ronan turned back to her. For a split second, Willa saw something like respect in his eyes. He said, "You did your research." It was not a question. "I came prepared," she replied. Ronan gave a single nod. He pulled out his phone and made a short call. Contact the Veo Foundation. I want to fund an art grant for Lincoln Elementary through the county program. Make it legal, with clean paperwork. Nothing can trace back to me. Have it done this week." He ended the call and looked at Willa. His voice was a flat warning. "If you take this job, you will be on Diane Hargrove's radar. She is not a pleasant woman." Willa glanced at her left arm, where an old scar was hidden by her sleeve. She looked up and said, "I have survived worse people." Ronan watched her for a moment longer, then held the door open. As she walked past, she heard him speak so quietly it was almost lost. "Thank you." She knew that word was difficult for him. She just nodded once and walked into the night, feeling stronger than she had in years. On Monday morning, Willa entered Lincoln Elementary. She was not a waitress anymore. She was a community art grant assistant with a new plastic ID badge on her chest. Her arms were full of crayons and paper she had bought with her tips. She was shaking inside, but she held her back straight. For 2 years, she had wanted to be in a school where nobody could make her leave. Harold Bryce met her with a weak smile and a damp handshake. He led her to the art room, a small space with a big window facing the playground. The walls had a few old drawings from last year. Bryce said a few polite words and then left quickly, like she was a threat. Willa arranged the room. She taped blank paper to the walls. She set out the crayons. The school bell rang, and the first students lined up at her door. She took a deep breath and opened it. 15 small faces stared back at her. They looked curious, bored, or ready for trouble. But Willa searched for just one face. She found him right away. Jonah stood at the back of the line. He was the smallest one, his head tilted down. His hair was short now, and the bandages were gone. He walked into the room, looking at the floor, until he glanced up and saw her. His gray eyes went wide. His mouth opened. Then something happened that Willa had only hoped for. Jonah smiled. It was a tiny smile, just a brief lift at the corner of his mouth, but it was the first smile she had ever seen on his face. In that moment, it was worth everything. "Miss Willa," he whispered. Willa blinked quickly and gave him her biggest smile. "Hello, artist. Please sit down. Today we are going to draw." She told the children they could draw anything they wanted. There were no rules. They could draw or color or just scribble. The kids started working, noisy and happy. Willa walked around the room, encouraging them, but she kept looking at the corner table where Jonah sat. He was quiet. He chose a black crayon and started drawing with great care. Willa stood behind him and looked at his paper. Her heart ached. In the center, Jonah had drawn a tiny house. It was surrounded by thick black darkness that almost swallowed it completely. But inside the little house, through a small window, he had drawn a single candle. It was a tiny point of yellow light in all that black. But it was there. It was burning. Willa understood. He was telling her that he still had hope, even when the darkness was so big. She sat next to him and spoke softly. "This is very beautiful. Do you want to add anything else inside the house?" Jonah looked at her, then picked up a brown crayon. He drew two small figures standing next to the candle. Willa knew who they were. At 3 o'clock, the bell rang. Willa cleaned the room and pinned the drawings on the wall. She carefully placed Jonah's picture inside her desk drawer. After locking up, she walked to the school gate and saw the gray Audi across the street. Ronan was leaning against it, his eyes on the gate. He looked like he had been waiting for a while. Jonah ran out, his backpack bouncing. He reached his father and said, louder than Willa had ever heard him, "Dad, Miss Willa is my teacher. She teaches at my school now." Ronan looked down at his son, then he looked up at Willa. He did something she did not expect. He smiled. It was a small smile, but it changed his entire face. He went from cold and dangerous to almost safe. "Thank you." "Jonah seems happier," Ronan said. His voice was stiff, not used to giving thanks. "Jonah is very talented," Willa answered, feeling just as awkward. "His drawing today was very special. I would like to keep it, if that is all right." Ronan nodded. They stood there in the afternoon light, just outside the school. Jonah stood between them, looking from one to the other. For the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. "See you tomorrow, Jonah," Willa said, turning away. She heard Ronan tell him to get in the car. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her. Down the street, Salararo watched from his own car. He saw his boss smiling at the woman like a schoolboy. "The boss has a problem now," he muttered to himself, "a big one." He started the engine and followed them. In the back seat, Jonah was tracing a shape on the window with his finger. It was the shape of a candle. Willa felt Diane Hargrove's influence at the school almost immediately. By Wednesday, the principal, Harold Bryce, appeared at her classroom door. His face was pale, and his bald head was covered in sweat. Bryce's hand crushed the stack of papers he was holding. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice shaking, "my office. Now." Willa followed him down the silent school hallway. Inside his office, an envelope from Hargrove and Associates sat on his desk. Bryce recited his lines without meeting her eyes. He said the school had received information. They knew about Meadow Creek Elementary 3 years ago. They knew about the allegations, the revoked license, and the parental complaint. The floor tilted under Willa's feet. This was not a surprise. It was a memory. The same accusation, the same lie pinning her down. "You know who sent this," Willa stated. Bryce looked at the desk. "Mrs. Hargrove is on the board," he continued, explaining Hargrove's demands. "Terminate Willa's contract immediately, or she would pull all funding and expose the allegations to every parent." Willa wanted to scream the truth. The story was fabricated. She was the one who had reported abuse, not committed it. But she saw in Bryce's eyes that he did not want the truth. He wanted the problem to vanish. He chose the easy path, not the right one, just like everyone before him. "I will not resign," Willa said, her voice impossibly calm. "The grant requires due process. I am requesting a hearing." Bryce was silent. Willa turned and walked out, her back straight, while her world shattered again. It was the same nightmare, playing on a loop. That evening at the Pinewood Diner, she knew something was wrong. Bet was not behind the counter. She sat at a corner table, looking small and broken. The 60-year-old woman seemed to have shrunk. In front of her was a letter with the Hargrove and Associates logo. Willa sat down, already knowing what it said. Bet's voice trembled as she spoke. A lawyer had visited that afternoon. He threatened the diner with constant health inspections unless Willa was fired. They would find a reason, any reason, to shut the place down. "Honey, I think of you as my own daughter," Bet whispered. "But this diner is all I have. I am too old to start over." Willa looked at the only person who had helped her, who had called her family. She could not let this happen. "Do not worry. I will handle it," Willa said, her voice steady. She removed her apron, hung it on its hook, and walked out the back door. The alley was narrow and dark, smelling of grease and garbage. A single yellow bulb cast a weak light on the damp brick walls. Willa slid down the wall until she sat on the cold concrete. She pulled her knees to her chest and finally broke down. This was not quiet crying. It was a storm of sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the child she had been, locked away and forgotten. She cried for the teacher no one believed. She cried for her brother, who had died in an alley just like this. She cried because she thought this time was different. But the world would not let Willa Clare protect anyone. She sat in the darkness until she was empty and her shirt was cold with sweat. Lifting her head, she saw a strip of night sky and thought of Jonah. He was a small candle in a dark house. Who would keep his flame burning if she was gone? She did not know how long she sat there. When she finally stood, her legs were numb. She went inside, washed her face, and told Bet she was leaving early. She walked back to her small studio on Division Street and climbed the 4 flights of stairs. The room was tiny, holding only a bed, a table, and a photo of her brother. She sat and stared at his picture, thinking about tomorrow. At 11:15 that night, a firm knock came at her door. Willa looked through the peephole. It was Ronan, standing in the dim hall with a paper bag. His face was half in shadow. She opened the door. She did not bother asking how he knew her address. Ronan was a man who knew things. "Where is Jonah?" she asked. "Someone is home with him, Herr Bassam," he replied, lifting the bag. "You have not eaten." It was a statement, not a question. He was right. The scent of rich beef stew and garlic bread rose from the bag. It was food from a good restaurant. Her studio was too small for 2 people. "It is cramped here," Willa said. "Let's go to the diner. I have the key." They walked the 3 blocks in the cold Chicago air without a word. Willa unlocked the diner's back door and switched on the counter lights, leaving the rest of the room dark. The neon signs outside cast blue and red light across the empty tables. She set the food out at the table where she always sat with Ronan and Jonah. The vinyl chair creaked under Ronan's weight as he sat. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. Then Ronan put his silverware down. "I know what happened at the school," he said. He explained that he monitored everything connected to Jonah. He knew about Diane Hargrove, the meeting with Bryce, and the threat to Bet. Willa felt a sudden rush of relief. She did not have to explain. He already knew. Ronan's voice lowered. "I also know the accusation is false." He had read the Meadow Creek file. She had not abused anyone. She had reported the abuser, and the school fired her to protect a wealthy donor. Willa's hands began to shake. After 3 years, someone finally believed her. In all the years since she was fired, no one had ever looked at her file and said they knew she was innocent. She looked down at her plate. She said if he wanted to know why she would not quit, why she would risk everything for a child that was not hers, she would tell him. Ronan remained silent, watching her. His silence was an invitation. So Willa told him her story. She spoke in a flat voice, her eyes fixed on the space between them. She was put in foster care at 2. Her first home locked her in a closet. Her second was where she got the burn. She pulled up a sleeve, revealing the dark, puckered skin on her arm. The marks were from cigarettes and a hot iron. She explained that her brother was also in the system. When she finally found him years later, he was an addict. That was why she had to fight. She could never give up on a child. She tried to save him, but never had enough money, or strength, or anything. 2 years ago, a November night began with a call from the police. It sent her running to an alley, where she found her brother. He was lying on the ground, his eyes wide open and cold, a syringe still clutched in his hand. She sat in the filth and held his body until the ambulance arrived, knowing they were in no hurry. Willa paused, but the tears would not come. She had already cried them all. Tonight was the end of it. Inside the diner, the only sound was the neon sign buzzing outside. Then Ronan spoke. His voice was different, broken and raw. He said his wife's name was Kara. 3 years ago, she had taken their son Jonah for ice cream. Jonah was 5 years old. Someone shot her twice, right in front of him. She collapsed on the sidewalk, and Jonah sat beside her in the spreading blood, waiting for the police. Ronan's voice cracked. He said they killed her because of him, because of the life he led and the enemies he made. He was the reason she was dead. He was the reason Jonah had no mother. Every day, he looked at his son and saw Kara's eyes. It was a constant reminder that he was why she was gone. The shifting neon light slid across Ronan's face, and Willa saw something he surely never let anyone see. It was a pure, soul-deep guilt, the kind that corrodes a man from the inside. She understood that the two of them, sitting in that empty diner, were both carrying the weight of the person they had loved most. She carried her brother, and he carried his wife, and both felt responsible. Willa knew that saying she understood was meaningless. Saying it was not his fault was a lie she had no right to tell. Instead, she reached out her hand and placed it over his clenched fist on the table. Her small, cold hand covered his large, warm knuckles. She said nothing. Ronan's whole body went rigid. Willa felt the muscles in his arm pull tight, like wires. Then very slowly, his fist opened. He turned his palm upward, and her fingers rested in his. They were warm together. Though the diner was cold and the night outside was colder, the silence was broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Willa could hear her own heart beating. This was the nearest she had felt to another person since that night in the alley with her brother. But this time, the man beside her was alive. He was warm. Then Ronan took his hand back. He moved slowly, as if the smallest distance caused him pain. Still, he pulled away. Willa knew why before he spoke. Anyone close to him was a target. Kara was his proof. He refused to let another person die for him. He stood and pushed his chair in neatly. It was a normal gesture after a moment that was anything but normal. For the first time in 3 years, he had shown his deepest wound to someone. He said, "Thank you for dinner." Willa knew he was not talking about the food. He was thanking her for listening, for staying, for that brief touch. He walked to the back door, opened it, and hesitated for a moment with his back to her. Then he stepped into the darkness and was gone. Willa sat alone. The neon light flickered. Her hand lay on the table. still holding the warmth from his. She stared at the closed door until the feeling on her skin faded away, but the feeling in her chest did not. Navarro did not drop the case, even when Morrison told her to, because every night, in her small apartment, she would lie in bed and see 14 push pins in a steel tray behind her closed eyes. She began to investigate on her own time, using none of the department's resources. It gave Morrison no reason to stop her. She started by officially requesting medical records from the elementary school. 4 days later, she sat at her kitchen table, flipping through the pages. She stopped on Trent Hargrove's file. Everything looked normal. Height, weight, and vision were all fine. The notes section was blank. Navarro knew from experience that a blank space can be more revealing than a full one. She checked the forms from previous years. The second grade record had a line crossed out in black ink. Holding it to the light, she could faintly read the word bruising and an unfamiliar signature. The third grade form was completely new, pristine, as if the old one never existed. Someone had altered the file. Navarro went to the County Department of Education. She spent 2 days finding the name of the school nurse who had suddenly quit her job at the school the previous year, Patricia Dunn. She was 53 and now lived a 20-minute drive away. Navarro visited her on a Saturday. Patricia opened the door with the expression of a person who had been waiting a long time for a knock that she never thought would come. She led Navarro to the kitchen and poured coffee. Her voice was steady, but it trembled with the weight of her memories. She had documented bruises on Trent Hargrove 3 separate times. The first was on his arm, the second on his back, the third on his hip. Each time, Trent gave the same rehearsed answer about falling. She knew he was lying, so she noted her findings. The next week, Diane Hargrove was in the principal's office with a lawyer. Diane claimed the notes were wrong and that her son was just an active boy. She threatened to sue Patricia personally for defamation if she continued. The principal simply nodded along. Patricia told them she would not delete the notes. A week later, she was fired due to staff restructuring. As she packed her office, she saw that Trent's medical file had been replaced with a spotless new copy. Her eyes were red as she told Navarro, "I know she hits him. Falls don't make finger-shaped marks." But I had no power. I was just a nurse. She had lawyers. I had nothing. Navarro took her statement and walked back to her car. She sat there for a long time staring out the windshield. The case was no longer what it seemed. Trent Hargrove was not just a bully. He was a victim. A 10-year-old boy was being hurt by his own mother, and no one was helping him. He was pouring all of that pain onto the one person he saw as weaker. Jonah was younger, quieter, and had fewer friends. But Jonah had something Trent did not have: a father, a devoted father who picked him up from school and looked at him with love. Trent did not hate Jonah for anything he had done. He hated Jonah for having the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world. Navarro now understood she had 2 children to protect, not just one. Later that week at the school, Willa was cleaning the art room at 3:15 in the afternoon. She heard the sound of high heels clicking in the hallway. Through the doorway, she saw Diane Hargrove walking toward her son's classroom. She was flawless, dressed in a fur coat, with a polite smile for a teacher she passed. A minute later, Diane came out with Trent at her side. The boy was neat in his uniform, but his expression was blank. Something about how he moved made Willa freeze. He leaned away from his mother, just slightly. His shoulders were tense when her hand came near him. Diane placed her right hand on Trent's shoulder. To a stranger, it would look like a mother's gentle guidance. But Willa was only 7 meters away. She saw it clearly. Diane's fingers were not resting on his shoulder. They were digging in, squeezing hard. Trent's face went pale and his jaw tightened. He stared straight ahead, his body rigid. He was absorbing a familiar pain, one so common it no longer made him flinch. Diane smiled perfectly, while her fingers crushed her son's shoulder. Willa knew that grip. She knew the pain it caused, and the bruise it left behind. A foster mother had done the same thing to her 20 years before. She saw her own past in Trent Hargrove's pale face. He was not the monster. His mother was, walking away in expensive heels and a fur coat. Trent and his mother vanished through the school doors. Willa stood frozen, then pulled out her phone. She found Investigator Navarro's business card and dialed. He answered quickly. Willa's voice was steady. She told him who she was. She needed to see him about Trent Hargrove and his mother. That evening, Ronan sat on the floor beside Jonah. His son drew in a sketchbook Willa had given him. The boy's head was almost healed. The dark curls were growing back over small scars. He looked more peaceful now. Still, Ronan knew that peace was fragile. His mind returned to the file on Diane Hargrove. He had enough information to ruin her family overnight. But Gino's warning echoed in his head. Every move he made would lead back to Jonah. Just then, Jonah stopped drawing. He looked up at his father. He asked a question Ronan was not ready for. "Dad, Miss Willa says violence never fixes violence. Do you think she is right?" Ronan could not breathe. His wife Kara used to say those exact words. She warned him that violence only creates more graves. He had not listened to her, and she became one of them. Ronan's voice was rough. "Mom said that every day. I did not listen, and I was wrong." Jonah looked at his father, then went back to his drawing. Ronan saw 3 figures on the paper, one large man, one small boy, and a tall woman with her hair tied up. He knew the 3rd figure was Willa. Later, after Jonah was asleep, Ronan sat with the file on Diane Hargrove. He made the most difficult decision of his life. He decided to trust a path without violence. He called Gino. He wanted Diane Hargrove exposed, but through legal means. He would use money and influence to turn her own system against her. He would fund private investigators and pressure judges. Everything had to be clean, with no link to the Caruso family. Gino was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ronan sounded like his wife. He meant it as a compliment. But Diane was not the type to wait for an attack. She felt the pressure building. She did what powerful people do. She struck first at the weakest point. An article appeared on a local news website. The headline was about a mysterious single father involved in the bullying case. It did not name Ronan, but the description was clear. A man with no profession and no public tax records, a son with his mother's last name, a house owned by shell companies. The article ended with a lethal question. Who was the man behind the injured child, and what was he hiding? Sal called Ronan at 6 in the morning. He said reporters were digging. One more layer, and they would find the Caruso name. Ronan looked at Jonah, who was eating cereal. He knew his son would become a target for all of his enemies. It was the most dangerous moment since Kara was shot. His 2 worlds, the underworld and the suburbs, were collapsing into each other. He needed to speak with Willa. She was the only person he did not have to pretend for. But before he could talk to her, he had to tell her the truth. The wall between his worlds was cracked. Letting her stay close without knowing the danger would make him the same man who got Kara killed. He called Willa that night. His voice was not the controlled tone she knew. It was the voice of a man on the edge of a cliff. He needed to see her at Jonah's house. Sal would take Jonah to a neighbor's home for an hour. She arrived at the house on Elmwood Street at 8 o'clock. Ronan opened the door. The house was empty except for them. A photo of Kara holding a newborn Jonah smiled from the wall. Ronan stood in the middle of the room, looking fragile. He did not invite her to sit. He stood in silence for a long time, gathering his courage. Then he spoke, directly and without preamble. My real name is Gian Carlo Ronan Caruso. I am the head of the Caruso family. If you have lived in Chicago long enough, you know what that name means. Willa stood, perfectly still. Her mind raced as every strange detail about him suddenly fell into place. He changed his entire persona before seeing his son, like taking off a costume. He was always close by in that black Lincoln. She remembered Jonah's terror, how the boy said he could never tell anyone because they would know who his father was. She saw how easily Ronan slipped into a role for Detective Navarro. He had learned everything about Diane Harrove in a single night and could fund a community project with a phone call. The Veo Foundation. Veo, the name of the restaurant on Taylor Street. It was all him. It was Caruso, the Caruso family. That name was a shadow over the city, whispered in bars and printed in headlines about Chicago's dark underbelly. And this man, whose hand she had held in a quiet diner, the one she told about her scars and her brother's death, the one person who made her feel safe. That man was a mob boss. Willa looked at Ronan and saw the familiar look of someone braced for rejection. He was waiting for her to run. She could see it in the hard line of his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. He was ready to lose her because he believed loss was all he deserved. You can go, Ronan said, his voice flat and cold again. You should go. I will find another way to keep Jonah safe. You owe us nothing. He looked away. Anyone who gets close to me becomes a target. Kara is proof of that. I would rather lose you alive right now than lose you the way I lost her. He said, lose you. The words echoed louder than anything else. A confession he never meant to make. The room was silent except for the ticking clock. Kara's picture smiled from the wall. Willa stood there, a 27-year-old waitress, with a small apartment and a burn on her arm, facing the most powerful man in Chicago. She thought of all the reasons to be afraid. The bullet that killed Kara. The people who simply disappeared. Rival families and the federal government. Danger was everywhere. But then she thought of Jonah. She saw his small hand holding hers in the hospital. She heard him whisper her name. She thought of herself as a child, hidden and afraid. She thought of the woman who cried alone behind the diner. Fear had ruled her entire life, but it had never saved her from anything. It only ever took things away. I have lived my whole life in danger, Willa said. Her voice was steady and strong. I have been in danger since I was 2 years old. I have been beaten, burned, and locked away. I lost my brother. There are many things I fear in this world, but I am not afraid to protect a child, and I am not afraid of you. Ronan stared at her. For 5 long seconds, his face was a mask. Willa wondered if he had even heard her. Then she saw it. A tiny glint of moisture in the corner of his right eye, catching the light. His lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in 20 years of absolute control, Gian Carlo Ronan Caruso did not know what to say. Everything fell apart for Diane Hargrove in just 2 weeks. Ronan's plan moved with speed and precision. His investigators, hired through layers of shell companies, found security footage from a neighbor's house. The camera caught Diane dragging Trent into the house by his hair. The boy struggled, but she pulled harder until he fell down the steps. The clip was only 23 seconds long, but it was enough to destroy her. The team sent the video to Navarro anonymously. Navarro walked into her superior's office, played the video on a tablet, and asked if he still wanted her to drop the case. Morrison watched in silence, then signed the order. Navarro went straight to Child Protective Services. She presented the video, the statement from Patricia Dunn, the altered medical files, and Willa's report. The social worker saw the evidence, looked at Navarro, and called a judge for an emergency order. At 6:15 the next morning, 3 police cars arrived at the Hargrove mansion. Charles Hargrove opened the door in a silk robe, his face turning pale when he saw the badge. Diane appeared behind him, her hair perfect. As Navarro read the Miranda rights, Diane's composure cracked. Her eyes darted back and forth. When Navarro brought out the handcuffs, Diane screamed, "Do not you know who I am?" Navarro calmly secured her wrist. The steel clicked shut. Diane Hargrove was led away, her eyes completely empty. Charles just stood in the doorway and watched. He said nothing. Navarro knew he had always known and had chosen to look away. Child Services took Trent from the home that morning. He sat in the car, clutching a backpack, his face hollow. He had the look of a child who had given up on hope. News of the arrest spread through the school quickly. In the middle of the chaos, something quiet happened. Trent was alone at his locker when Jonah approached him. Trent tensed, expecting payback for all the cruelty. But Jonah did not mention the thumbtacks or the pain. He just held out a folded piece of paper. When Trent did not take it, Jonah placed it on the locker shelf. "I know you are hurting too," Jonah said, then walked away. Trent unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing of 2 children standing together under a big yellow sun. They were not smiling, but they stood side by side, their shoulders touching. Trent looked at the drawing, and tears fell onto the paper. It was the first time he had cried from kindness instead of pain. At the end of the hall, Willa watched, with tears on her face. She was seeing that healing comes not from adults or rules, but from an 8-year-old boy forgiving the person who hurt him most. 2 weeks later, Willa got a letter from the Board of Education. It said the old abuse allegation against her had been reviewed. New evidence proved she was innocent and that the parent who accused her was the actual abuser. Willa Sinclair was finally free. Her name was finally clear. The letter proved her innocence, restored her teaching license, and erased the stain from her record. She was sitting in the art room at Lincoln Elementary when she read it. Her fingers shook as she went over the words again and again. For 3 years, a heavy weight had pressed down on her. Suddenly, it was gone. She felt impossibly light. She knew Ronan was behind this. Only he had the power to undo years of injustice in just a few weeks. That evening, he came to get Jonah. Their eyes met across the schoolyard. He gave her a slight nod. She nodded back. No words were needed. The silent gesture said more than thank you ever could. A week later, Willa was offered a permanent job. She was the full-time art teacher. She attached a plaque with her name on it to the art room door. Willa St. Clair. For the first time, her name belonged to a place that no one could take from her. Willa spent weeks planning the anti-bullying mural. She sketched ideas and chose colors. The wall was huge, running from the school entrance to the gym. It was a perfect blank white canvas. She invited every student to join, but she already knew who her main artist was. On the first morning, Jonah showed up early. His backpack was filled with brushes. His eyes were shining with a light she had feared was gone forever. He stood before the wall, dipped a brush in blue paint, and began to create. He started in the middle and worked his way out. He painted hands. Dozens of hands in every shade and size. They were all lifting each other up, weaving together in a chain of support. Above them, golden light broke through dark clouds. The sky was not perfect, but the light was winning. Other kids came to watch. They asked if they could help. Jonah smiled and handed them a brush, his voice clear and steady. The boy who was once the school's quietest student was now the center of attention. He showed other kids how to mix their paints. He helped them find a place on the wall for their own handprint. Then Willa saw Owen. He was standing far down the hall, hiding by a locker. He stared at Jonah, but did not move closer. His hand kept rubbing his wrist, pulling his sleeve down over and over. Willa knew of that gesture. She had done the same thing for 20 years, trying to hide her own scars. Her heart ached, but she stayed where she was. This was not her moment. Jonah saw him. He put his brush down and walked calmly toward Owen. He did not look at Owen's wrist. He did not ask what was wrong. He just held out a clean paintbrush. He said, "Do you want to paint with me?" Owen looked from the brush to Jonah's face, then back again. He nodded. The two boys walked to the wall together. Owen took the brush. He dipped it in yellow paint. In a bottom corner of the mural, he added one small hand, reaching for the light. Willa watched from the doorway with tears on her face. She was smiling. This was healing. It was spreading from one child to another, with no help from any adult. Jonah had learned to see another person's pain because he had lived through his own. But unlike Trent, he did not use his pain to hurt others. He used it to reach out. The next morning, Ronan placed a chair in the bathroom. He wrapped a towel around Jonah's shoulders and picked up a pair of scissors. Jonah's hair had grown long and messy. This time, Ronan wanted to be the one to cut it. His hands were unsteady. Every time the scissors touched Jonah's hair, he remembered the pushpins. He cut slowly, afraid he might hurt him. "Do you trust me?" Ronan asked, his voice strained. Jonah met his father's eyes in the mirror. "I trust you." Ronan started to cut. Willa had shown him how, drawing diagrams on a napkin. He had studied them like he was learning to open a vault. The quiet sound of the scissors filled the room. Black curls fell onto the floor. As he worked, Ronan told Jonah about his grandmother in Sicily. He said she cut hair for everyone in her neighborhood. People would line up outside her house on Sundays. She used old scissors and told stories while she worked. He paused. She painted too, just like you. Everything she made was beautiful. She used to say that a good haircut could change a person. She believed beauty could be found in broken things. Ronan stopped, his voice trembling. "I wish you could have met her." Jonah was silent, watching the man in the mirror. He saw the kindness in his father's large hands. Those hands were not made for delicate work, but they had learned. When he finished, Ronan combed Jonah's hair one last time. It was neat and short. It framed the small face that had his father's jaw and his gray eyes. Jonah looked at himself. He touched his hair. Then he looked at his father in the reflection and said, "I look like you." Just 3 words. They shattered Ronan's composure. For years, he had feared his son would hate him. He thought Jonah would blame him for his mother's death. But here was his son, saying he looked like him, and saying it with pride. Ronan put his hands on Jonah's shoulders. "You're strong," he whispered, his voice cracking. Tears fell. The man feared all over Chicago stood in a small bathroom and cried. Jonah turned around and wrapped his arms around his father. He laid his head on Ronan's chest, and they stood there, holding on to each other. The morning sun warmed Lincoln Park, as Ronan laid a blanket under their old oak tree. Clippings of dark hair from a recent cut scattered at their feet. It was their spot, claimed 3 weeks ago. The tree's roots rose like small walls, creating a private space. Jonah was already on his stomach, pencil flying across his sketchbook. He would glance at the clouds for a moment, then dive back into his drawing. His freshly trimmed curls caught the light. Willa unpacked the picnic basket she had prepared at Pinewood that morning. Her instructions were clear. She was feeding her 3 children, so no food could be left behind. She had made grilled cheese sandwiches for Jonah, cut into triangles just the way he liked. For Ronan, a steak sandwich with extra pickles, a preference she had noticed, but he had never mentioned. For herself, she packed a chicken sandwich she knew she would not finish. She would be too busy watching the two of them eat. Willa handed a sandwich to Jonah. For the artist, she said. She turned to Ronan with a small smile. And extra pickles for the barber. Ronan gave her a familiar look. It was the expression of a man surprised by how comfortable someone could be around him. They ate as sunlight dappled through the leaves overhead. The sound of children laughing mixed with birdsong. Ronan sat in his jacket, hiding the suit he wore for a meeting he did not explain. She recognized the tattoos on his arms from when he helped her clean the art room. She saw the compass, the dove, and Jonah's name over older, darker images. She never asked about them. He would tell her when he was ready. Jonah finished his food and pointed to the sky. "Dad, that cloud looks like a dragon." Ronan looked up. "Where?" Jonah pointed. "There, look at the wing. And it is breathing fire," Jonah added. Willa lay down next to him and said she could see it, too. "That one looks like your dad's car," she said. Jonah laughed. "It does, but it's bigger." Ronan watched them, a warm feeling rising in his chest. It was the same feeling from the night her hand covered his in the diner. He thought it had died with Kara on a city sidewalk 3 years ago, but it had only been sleeping, and now it was waking up. He was still afraid of it. The last time it woke, it took the woman he loved. But he did not think about that today. Today he watched Jonah smile. He watched Willa, who looked truly calm for the first time. The sun turned her skin to gold. He thought if he died in that moment, he would have no regrets. The afternoon slowly faded. Other families packed up and left, but the three of them stayed, not wanting the day to end. As the sun set, Jonah sat up and gave the finished drawing to Ronan. Ronan stared at the page and could not speak. Jonah had drawn the three of them under the big oak tree. A large man sat up on the blanket. A small boy drew beside him. A woman with brown hair lay on the blanket with her eyes closed and a soft smile. Above them, the sky was full of sunlight and green leaves. At the top of the page, written in the messy letters of an 8-year-old, was a single word in red crayon: family. Ronan looked from the drawing to Jonah and then to Willa. His throat was too tight to form words. Willa saw the word and thought of all the years she believed family was not for her. She had always felt like she was on the outside looking in. Now a little boy had drawn her into his, as if it was the most simple thing in the world. As the sun disappeared, Jonah fell asleep on the blanket, his sketchbook resting beside him. Ronan carefully folded the drawing and placed it in the backpack. He draped his leather jacket over his son, his large hands gently pulling the collar to Jonah's chin. It was a tenderness that proved hands made to destroy could learn to protect. The setting sun washed the world in gold, lighting Jonah's sleeping face and the silver in Ronan's beard. Willa shifted closer until their shoulders touched. She leaned her head against him and whispered, "Sometimes angels do not have wings. They wear suits and carry a past everyone fears." He felt her warmth, heard her words, and his throat grew tight. He slowly found her hand and took it, his fingers weaving through hers. This time, he did not pull back. He did not get up and leave. He just stayed, holding her hand. Willa felt his grip tighten, saying what his voice could not. "I am here. I am not leaving." They sat together in silence. Jonah slept soundly beside them, the picture labeled family, now safe inside the bag. The world was so still that Willa could hear her own heart beating. She thought maybe this is what home truly meant. Not a house, but a hand holding yours that refuses to let go. This story teaches us something we often forget. The people who save us are not always heroes with power or wealth. Sometimes they are the quiet ones. The waitress who remembers your order, the stranger who sees your bruise and does not look away, the broken soul who recognizes your pain because they have carried the same wounds. Real strength is not found in fists or fury. It is found in the trembling hands of a father learning to cut his son's hair. It is found in a woman who chose to speak up when staying silent would have been easier. And it is found in a little boy brave enough to trust again after the world taught him that trust only leads to pain. If there is one thing to carry with you from this story, let it be this: never underestimate the power of one person who refuses to look away. You might be that person for someone today. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit the like button. It costs nothing, but it helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. Share this video with someone who has been through hard times, someone who needs to know they are not alone. And if you have not already, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Was it the thumbtacks hidden beneath a child's hair? Was it Willa's promise? Or was it the word family, written in red crayon? Your words keep us going. They remind us why we do this. We wish everyone watching this video health, peace, and the courage to look closer at the people around you. Goodbye, and we will see you again in our next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.